Time had run out. The landlord smirked, waving the eviction papers in the air as movers stomped up onto the porch. Rain darkened the Chicago street, and people raised their phones to record from every angle. Margaret clutched a brass key tight against her chest like it was the only thing keeping her alive. George leaned hard on his cane, refusing to budge. Then a car horn split through the tense silence, and a sleek black sedan screeched to a stop at the curb. A woman in a sharp navy suit stepped out, holding papers that caught the light. Right behind her, a military jeep rolled up, and a man in uniform climbed out. Moments later, an SUV pulled in, cameras flashing like fireworks. The crowd let out a collective gasp, whispers flying back and forth. Who were these people? And why did the landlord suddenly lose all the color in his face? The porch light gave a weak flicker as the kids pressed together, standing like a shield in front of their parents. What happened after that would shake the entire neighborhood to its core. Before the story goes further, the narrator asked for a quick pause. They urged listeners to hit that subscribe button, reminding them that every bit of support helps bring more powerful stories to life. Then, with the stage set, the tale truly began. Get out of this house. George gave a dry, weary laugh, the kind that carried the weight of dust and years. His hand trembled slightly as he set a chipped mug beside Margaret's pillbox. She adjusted her cardigan on her shoulder, blinked to shake the morning haze, and slipped a worn ribbon from her pocket. Hanging from that ribbon was a brass key, polished smooth by time. She pressed it into her palm as if she were praying. The little bungalow carried the scent of lemon oil and well-loved books. Morning sunlight drifted across the framed photographs on the mantel, catching on one in particular, 3 pale kids with toothy smiles standing proudly between a much younger George and Margaret. Adoption Day. That memory still carried warmth. Margaret let out a slow breath. We built our life here, she whispered. Every wall holds our story. Outside, a car crept past the window, moving so slowly it felt more like a taunt. It was Richard Collins again. He had this habit of circling the block, always pretending to check gutters or scribble notes on his phone. Neighbors pretended not to notice, but curtains were shifting. He's back, came a quiet comment from someone walking by. He wants that lot, another voice muttered. Those old folks won't last through winter anyway. The words hung in the cold air. George eased himself onto the porch swing, the chain squeaking with his weight. He rubbed at a scuff on his shoe, tried to work it out, but it wouldn't disappear. Across the hedge, Richard lifted a camera to eye level. Morning, he called, his voice overly cheerful. The terms are clear. The market's changed, and so have your rights. He grinned, but the smile never reached his teeth. Rights don't rise and fall with prices, Margaret answered. She stood, her back straight as if she were drawing a line in the sand, and tied the ribbon tighter around the brass key. Her tone stayed calm, but there was steel underneath it. You served notice. We appealed. You know that. Richard snapped his clipboard shut. Appeals expire. Deadlines run out. He stepped closer, his polished shoe landing on the one cracked tile of the porch steps. He wrinkled his nose, as if even the house offended him. I'll be back, with movers. Curiosity had a way of spreading. By noon, the neighborhood was buzzing. Someone filmed a strip of peeling paint and labeled the house an eyesore. Another person whispered about a developer who had his eye on corner lots. A teenager pedaled slow circles on his bike and muttered, "This is gonna blow up online if it gets ugly." Inside, Margaret's fingertip traced the glass of the photo frame. She remembered the first night the kids slept in that house, how the walls seemed to settle and sigh, almost as if they were learning the children's names. George bent down to grab a letter that had slipped to the floor, wincing as his joints protested. "We're not leaving," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the pain. "Not as long as I can stand." Margaret nodded, her gaze locked on the brass key. The porch light clicked on earlier than usual, scattering tiny flecks of dust that shimmered like little galaxies. Outside, Richard typed on his phone, glanced up once more, and snapped a final photo before walking off, whistling a tune that didn't belong on that street. The house seemed to listen. The ribbon in Margaret's hand grew warm. And somewhere far away, in 3 separate lives that had all started on that porch, 3 phones buzzed at the same time. The first knock came with a drizzle that smelled like wet copper. Richard didn't wait for anyone to answer. He slid a thick envelope through the mail slot and snapped a picture of it lying on the rug. Margaret bent to pick it up, steadying her breath before tearing the flap open with her nail. The words hit like a punch, final notice. 30 days. George read the letter twice, his lips silently shaping each word. Then he tucked it beneath a cookbook, as if flour and butter could somehow swallow up the truth. Our appeal is still pending, he muttered, voice thin and weary. He reached for Margaret's hand, rubbing that soft spot between her thumb and wrist, the same way he used to during endless hospital nights. But the neighborhood had ears. 30 days, someone whispered from behind the hedge. He's gonna flip that house by summer, another said. A sharper voice, wired with caffeine, added, the city won't care. Just watch. The couple tried their small defenses. George tightened the porch rail with stubborn hands, while Margaret labeled boxes, not for moving, but for proof. Sunday school crafts, the adoption decree, a birthday card scrawled with 3 messy signatures and a smudge of chocolate from a little thumbprint. The brass key still hung on her ribbon, warm from her palm. She checked it every hour like it was a pulse-keeping time. Richard Collins ramped things up. Certified letters started arriving. A contractor came at noon to measure windows. A notice, stamped in red, was stapled to the old maple tree, the ink bleeding as the rain soaked through. Richard thrived on the attention. He waved to the phones aimed at him. Just following the law, he called out loudly enough for the entire sidewalk to hear. They're months behind. Cameras panned to ceilings and floors, but not to the receipts George kept carefully filed away. A week later, a postcard came from the sheriff's office. The possession date was set. Margaret read it at the doorway, her voice catching on the date before she steadied herself. We hold, she said, smoothing her cardigan and blinking back the sting in her eyes. She placed the card face down on the table. That night dragged. Pipes clicked in the walls. A siren moaned 2 blocks over. George lay awake listening to Margaret breathe, counting the small gaps between one inhale and the next. He thought about the first crib he built in the living room, how the whole house seemed to lean closer, listening for the sound of a newborn's cry. In the dark, he whispered their children's names like a quiet roll call. Morning offered no relief. A moving truck prowled the corner like a shark circling prey. The driver idled, drumming his fingers on the wheel. Neighbors gathered in little knots, arms folded, coffee cooling in their hands. You recording? Someone asked. Always, came the reply. If they drag them out, tag me, a teenager muttered. Richard arrived carrying a folder and a smile that didn't touch his eyes. The sheriff followed right behind, hat pulled low, his face unreadable. Margaret stood tall on the porch, pressing the brass key flat against her lifeline. George tugged at his collar, fumbling to fix it, and then tried again. It's time, Richard said, motioning to the steps. Let's cooperate and keep this civil. George planted his cane firmly at the top stair. This home is paid on time, he said, holding up a folder. Your numbers are a trick. These are receipts. He extended the papers toward the sheriff. The sheriff glanced at them, blinked once, then looked away. Procedure was like a tide, too heavy to fight. Richard gave the signal. 2 movers clonked up the steps, their boots thudding like drums. Phones rose all around like a forest of glowing branches. The air carried the sharp tang of metal. Margaret opened her palm, letting the brass key gleam briefly before her fingers closed around it again. She took one breath. Then another. "We are not alone," she said softly, though she wasn't sure if she meant just the two of them or something greater. The movers reached the doorway. A horn blared at the corner, low and steady. Heads whipped toward the sound. The truck driver straightened in his seat. Somewhere nearby, a door slammed shut with purpose. The crowd shifted, drawn toward the noise. The horn sounded again, deliberate and unbroken, cutting straight through the nervous murmur of the onlookers. Phones turned as one toward the corner, just in time to catch a sleek black sedan gliding into view, its tires hissing against the wet asphalt. Headlights swept across anxious faces before the car eased to a stop right in front of the Brooks home. The back door swung open. Sarah stepped out. Tall. Steady. Her navy suit still sharp despite the drizzle. She adjusted the strap of her briefcase, blinked away the rain, and smoothed her sleeve with the kind of precision that said she was used to commanding a room. The crowd leaned in. "That's a lawyer," someone whispered. "She looks expensive," another voice added. But Sarah didn't glance at them. Her eyes locked straight on her parents, standing firm on the porch. Margaret's fingers clenched tight around the brass key. George's cane pressed firm against the top step. Sarah drew a breath, held it for a beat, and crossed the lawn with calm determination. The sheriff half turned, surprise flickering in his eyes. "Hold the eviction," Sarah said, her voice clear enough for the entire block to hear. She pulled a stack of papers from her case. The papers Sarah pulled out were tucked inside clear plastic sleeves, each stamped with a bold red injunction. "Filed this morning," she said firmly. "You can't touch them. Not today. Not tomorrow." She handed the packet to the sheriff with a faint smile that didn't quite reach her lips. Richard Collins's smirk faltered. "This is harassment." "Just stalling tactics," he barked, but his voice cracked at the end. He dabbed his forehead with a folded handkerchief, eyes darting nervously toward the swelling crowd. Before he could steady himself, another sound rolled in, deep and mechanical. Heads turned as a green military jeep rumbled onto the block, its tires crushing puddles beneath it. Instinctively, neighbors stepped back. From the driver's seat climbed David. His posture was rigid, shoulders squared under his officer's uniform, metals gleaming sharp against the dim light. He paused to adjust his belt, then walked forward, boots clicking with authority. His gaze swept from Richard to the movers, then to the sheriff. When he finally spoke, it was quiet, but the whole block heard him. "Evicting seniors under false claims isn't just civil. It's elder abuse. That makes it criminal. You really want this on record?" The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. The movers set their boxes down, avoiding eye contact altogether. "That's their son," someone whispered in the crowd. "Military," another murmured. "Oh, this just changed everything." Richard stammered. You can't just show up in costume." But his words died as yet another vehicle rolled in. This time, it was a glossy black SUV that drew every eye like a magnet. Its tinted windows mirrored the crowd until the back door opened, and Michael stepped out. Phone to his ear, no uniform, no suit, just dark jeans, a tailored coat, and the kind of confidence that naturally turned heads. Two men with heavy cameras followed close behind. "Press." Someone tugged a friend's sleeve and whispered, "He brought the media." Michael ended his call, smirked faintly, and gestured toward the cameras. "Funny thing about markets," he said smoothly. "Developers love attention, until it starts looking like bullying old folks. Guess who's trending right now?" He pulled a folded document from his coat, crisp and clean. "And just so we're clear, Richard," he added, tilting his head with one eyebrow raised, "I closed on a note for this property yesterday. The mortgage is mine. Which means, technically, you're trespassing." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Phones tilted higher, recording every blink, every twitch. Richard's handkerchief slipped from his grip. He bent to grab it, fumbled, cursed under his breath. On the porch, Margaret let out a sound somewhere between a sob and a laugh, pressing the brass key flat against her chest as the ribbon trembled. George blinked hard, wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, and leaned heavier on his cane. The entire street had shifted. What began as a routine eviction had become a spectacle. Neighbors whispered, "Are you seeing this?" Another muttered, "They raised those kids right." The teenager on his bike whispered into his phone, "This is going viral for real." Richard opened his mouth to argue but nothing came out. Because standing side by side now were the Brooks children, Sarah the lawyer, David the soldier, Michael the entrepreneur, forming an unshakable wall in front of their parents. Cameras zoomed in, catching the brass key gleaming in Margaret's hand like a signal. The storm had gathered, and for the first time, Richard looked small against it. The drizzle hissed against the pavement. Phones stayed lifted. The entire block held its breath as Richard tried to recover his footing. He tugged at his collar, adjusted his tie, and forced a grin that quivered at the edges. "You think a little theater changes the law?" His voice was thin, pitched higher than usual. He slapped the eviction folder against his palm, the sound sharp and hollow. "They're behind. They're squatters. This house is mine, and no parlor tricks will." But Sarah's voice sliced clean through his rant. She stepped forward, heels clicking on the wet porch. From her briefcase, she drew out a thick stack of receipts, mortgage payments, utilities, taxes, all organized and undeniable. She handed them to the sheriff, her nails tapping once on the top page for emphasis. "This isn't neglect," she said evenly. "It's fraud." "His fraud," Sarah said flatly. The sheriff tugged at his hat, brows drawn tight as he scanned the stack of documents. His lips moved silently over the figures before he lifted his eyes toward Richard. His jaw hardened, but he stayed quiet. Richard's face turned beet red. "They're old," he muttered. "They won't fight. This is. Watch your tone." David's voice hit the air like a weight, heavy and sharp enough to make the crowd flinch. He stepped forward, boots splashing in a shallow puddle, one hand brushing against the insignia on his chest as he squared himself at Richard. "Threatening seniors is intimidation," he said, his stare locked in. "That's a chargeable offense. What you're pulling here isn't just eviction, it's coercion. It's criminal. Argue with them if you want." He tilted his head toward his parents, then back again, "But you'll be answering to me." The crowd rippled with murmurs. "That's military brass," someone whispered. "The real deal." "He's finished," another voice said. Richard opened his mouth again, but Michael was already sliding in, a faint smirk curling at the corner of his lips. He held up a pristine white envelope, edges still sealed. "In case my brother and sister weren't clear enough," Michael said smoothly, "I'll make mine simple." He slid the document halfway out, the embossed seal catching the glow of camera flashes. "I own this property now. Mortgage, title, note, all of it. Paid in full." He let the words settle into the growing silence before finishing, "You're not a landlord here, Richard. You're loitering." Gasps burst across the street like a breaking wave. A woman clapped her hand over her mouth. The teen on his bike almost dropped his phone. Someone let out a short, nervous laugh. "Loitering," another voice repeated, shaking their head. Richard staggered back a step, folder slipping from his hands. Papers scattered across the wet sidewalk, the ink bleeding into the drizzle. He bent down to grab them, but his hand shook too much. When he finally looked up, the smirk was gone. That's when Margaret stepped forward, leaning on George's arm. She raised the brass key high, ribbon dangling, holding it like a small torch against the night. Her voice, though quiet, carried down the block. "This key has opened that door for 40 years, she said. "And no one, not threats, not money, not greed, will ever take it from us." The crowd erupted. Cheers, claps, whistles. Phones tilted higher, capturing Margaret's trembling hand, George's steady arm, and the three children standing in front of them like a living shield. The drizzle shimmered in the porch light, soft but relentless. Richard tried one last time, his voice raw. "This isn't over." "It is," Sarah cut in cleanly, her words sharp as a blade. She nodded at the sheriff, who had already lowered his clipboard and snapped the eviction file shut with deliberate finality. "Effective immediately." Richard's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Every camera caught it, every blink, every twitch, every crack in his mask. He turned sharply, nearly tripping on the step as he stormed to his car. The crowd parted only enough to let him through, their whispers trailing him like a swarm until his taillights vanished down the street. Michael slipped his phone into his pocket. David exhaled through his nose. Sarah snapped her case closed. The three of them turned, not to the sheriff, not to the neighbors, not even to the cameras, but back to their parents. The porch light flickered once, then steadied. And in that glow, the Brooks weren't standing alone anymore. Their children had turned a nightmare into a reckoning. The balance of power had shifted. The landlord was nothing more than a ghost walking away. The rain softened into a mist, blurring the edges of the crowd. Phones still hovered in the air, but the sound was different now, claps, whistles, even a few voices calling out the Brooks' name. The eviction meant to humiliate them had flipped into something else entirely, a spectacle of loyalty, a public stand of family against greed. Margaret lowered the brass key into her palm and kissed it lightly, her lips trembling. She turned it in her fingers until the ribbon brushed her cheek. George steadied her with one hand on her back, eyes blinking hard behind thick glasses. The old porch swing creaked faintly in the wind, the same swing where, decades earlier, they'd rocked babies who had now grown into the very people standing guard in front of them. Sarah straightened her damp blazer, gave her mother a small, private smile, then lifted her chin at the cameras. Fraud exposed. Case dismissed. Eviction blocked. Her voice rang calm and certain, but as she spoke, her hand reached back. Sarah gave her mother's hand a squeeze, a quiet gesture of reassurance. David finally undid the top clasp of his uniform jacket and let out a long breath, his shoulders easing for the first time all night. He looked over at his father and gave him a single nod. "He won't be back," he said, matter of fact. "Not with charges hanging over his head." His voice was steady, but underneath it burned a low, contained fury, the kind that only comes from watching people you love being cornered. Meanwhile, Michael slipped the property deed from his pocket and placed it carefully in George's hands. "It's yours now," he said softly, though the cameras strained to catch every word. "No mortgage. No loopholes. Nobody touches it again." George's hands trembled as he ran his fingers over the embossed seal. "You bought this for us?" His voice cracked with disbelief. Michael gave a small shrug, though his eyes glistened. "For family," he answered. "You gave us a home when no one else would. We're just returning the favor." The crowd stirred. Neighbors who had been skeptical were now nodding, whispering things like, "They raised them right," and, "Blood don't matter, look at that loyalty." A boy on his bike whispered into his phone, "Whole street just watched history happen." The sheriff tipped his hat, his face set in a mix of relief and shame, then turned away, leaving Richard's papers bleeding ink into the wet pavement. Margaret pressed the brass key into George's hand and folded his fingers around it. "We started with this key," she whispered. "And it ends with us keeping it." Her eyes filled as her chest rose in quick, sharp breaths. The three children stepped closer, forming a small protective circle around their parents at the base of the porch. Neighbors stood silently, watching the Brooks family shoulder to shoulder, as if welded together by something stronger than blood. The porch light above them glowed steady now, painting their faces in warm gold against the dark, rainy street. Somewhere, a neighbor whispered, "That'll be on the news tonight." Another voice answered, "It should be. People need to see this." Margaret leaned into George's shoulder. Her cardigan was damp, her ribbon wet but unbroken. "We're safe," she said softly. The brass key caught one last flash of light, not just a tool for a lock anymore, but a symbol. A symbol of home, of memory, of the kind of love that raised children strong enough to shield them when it mattered most. Slowly, the crowd began to thin, their whispers trailing down the block. The Brooks family stood still together, letting the moment sink into the very walls of their home. For the first time in months, they breathed without fear. The landlord had tried to erase them. Instead, their story had been etched permanently, into the neighborhood, into the cameras, and into the hearts of everyone who had witnessed it. The home was theirs. The fight was over. And at last, their legacy was safe. And if this story moved you, remember, there are countless untold battles like this happening every single day. Don't let stories of loyalty, justice, and unexpected strength go unheard. Hit subscribe, tap the notification bell, and share this video so more people can see what happens when family and truth step in.